Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Oh, that's our timer going off. Wonderful. Welcome to our webinar series, Navigating the Blizzard. I know that everyone is experiencing some challenging times at the moment as the world responds to COVID-19. And as businesses, we work out how we're navigating the blizzard, navigating the challenge that has been put upon us as directors, as chief executives, as managers, and as shareholders in businesses. At the Sirdar Group, we have decided to engage this process and this challenge, if you like, by running this series over the next few weeks called Navigating the Blizzard, where we're bringing experts in different fields to the conversation to support businesses who may be struggling to understand what to do right now, directors who are trying to tackle and answer questions that you haven't had to engage or be challenged by or tackle before. Navigating the Blizzard being the title for the series because the Sirdar is the name given to the lead Sherpa on a mountain expedition. And then the Sirdar is often the one that gets you safely to the summit, guides you through the blizzard that appears often from nowhere. And I think as we reflect on even just what's happened this week, the blizzard is truly hit and certainly hitting here in South Africa and here in Africa more than it was even just a week ago. So before we go into the content of today, I want to just introduce to you a friend and a colleague, John Evans of RS Advisors. John's someone that I've known for a few years now. Is an absolute expert in the field of business rescue. Not really a conversation many business owners want to be having, but one that really may be necessary and might be the lifeline that some of you as businesses should be having and discussing and engaging with. At the very least, we want to make sure that everyone on the call gets some value out of this that you can apply to your business. And so John's also going to be a little bit later in the webinar talking a little bit about managing through a crisis, and particularly managing cash flow through a crisis. But as we start each of these webinars, and before I ask John to just introduce himself a little bit more than I have, I wanted to start off by just reminding us that at the first and foremost of this whole scenario that COVID-19 has brought on the world is human impact. And so I did give John a warning that I was going to ask him before he started talking business, what was something that had impacted him at home in relation to COVID-19, and to share to start with, you know, the biggest thing this week that COVID-19 has done to our family is postponed my mum's wedding. And I think that for all of us, we've got stories and scenarios like that are going on. You know, it's something she's obviously been looking forward to with her fiance for a number of months now. We're in South Africa, but my mum's a New Zealander and is in New Zealand. So it's also meant that with Qantas saying they're not flying anymore internationally until the end of May, we're grounded here and won't be going. So this is having human impact even before we start talking about it having business impact. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to John and just ask John for you to share your story and introduction, and then we're going to get into today's webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. Just by way of a bit of further introduction, I'm a chartered accountant by training, so I understand the numbers reasonably well, but I've only ever practiced as a business rescue practitioner or turnaround advisor. I worked out many years ago I didn't want to be an auditor, and I found out that in Australia you could become a chartered accountant without needing to be an auditor, and you could learn to be one by practicing being a liquidator or a turnaround specialist. For me, it's landing with my bum in the butter. It's a perfect job for my personality fit. And I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about that, about what that means. From a COVID-19 perspective, my experience has been a whole lot more pleasant than Carl's. I was supposed to be attending a conference in Cape Town over the weekend, and it was cancelled. So unfortunately, I had to spend the weekend in a very remote wine farm called Hermanus Pietersfontein, in a cottage with nobody for miles around, that was well stocked with the winery's produce. So all in all, it's been quite a pleasant experience. I'm now back in Joburg, of course, and decided to quarantine myself away from my parents who live next door. So we're having conversations across the fence, and I'm leaving supplies in wheelbarrows for them to come and fetch at a later stage with their hand sanitizer in full force. Okay, thanks, Carl.
Thanks, John. So today's conversation is, as a board, at what stage should we be having the business rescue conversation? John says there's a fairly easy answer to this, so I'm going to let John take us through.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Carl. I started preparing these slides and I realized, well, actually at a board level, you need to consider cash flow all the time. And you have fairly onerous requirements to assess your liquidity repeatedly through the year. So, and when we discuss a little bit more about how the Companies Act defines financially distressed and should you be considering business rescue, it could potentially be a topic that comes up more often than you think. I've tried to, Carl's forced me to think a little bit more, a little bit differently today, and put on my hat as a board perspective. I have served on a number of listed boards and various things, so I do understand the environment you're faced with. And at all times, I'll try and revert it back to how I think a board should be thinking about their business and the stresses it's under, particularly at the moment, which is a very stressful time. Some of you may or may not have noticed, but one of the companies I'm involved with at the moment has just suspended all international and regional flights. That's SAA. They may as well have suspended their whole business because they're only flying to Cape Town 4 times a day now. So effectively, that business has been mothballed, I would call it. Qantas, as Carl mentioned, has done the same. And obviously, their board has looked at their cash flows and their forecast for the foreseeable future and come to a conclusion that this is the best measure they need to take to protect their business and hopefully have a business once the crisis recedes. So I think I'll dive in. I'll start off with some fairly simple definitions as set out in the Companies Act. Those are very useful to guide our conversation. But effectively, the Companies Act and the revision published in 2011 has this thing called business rescue. In South African terms, it's relatively new. In global terms, the concept of rescuing rather than liquidating businesses has been around for a long time. And I was doing administrations in Australia in the mid-90s. And it's a very similar concept to Chapter 11, to administration, that you'd come across as a term used. And what it really does, and this is verbatim out of the Act, it provides for temporary supervision of the company. It provides for a moratorium. Now, the moratorium is essentially a simple concept. It says a creditor or a claimant can't enforce their rights against the company for the duration of business rescue. So there's 2 things there. The supervision provides, let's call it independent third-party oversight, which is designed to build trust between the company, the process, and its creditors. And the moratorium is supposed to provide the breathing room. Now, without the third-party intervention, the creditors are often reluctant to give the breathing space. So they're trying to blend the two to say, we've got an independent expert to come and guide the company through the process. And you need to sit tight for 3 months. And they're designed to provide the comfort. The main aim of rescue is to develop a plan to rescue the company and then to implement that plan. That's very easy to write down, easy to say, very complicated to do. And it's something that we need to work on. The Act does say that there's 2 real objectives of rescue. It's got to maximize the likelihood of the company continuing in existence. And if that's not possible, to be better for creditors and shareholders than liquidation of the company. Now those are 2 fairly simple concepts, and we'll explore them a little bit later. But I think if we move on from there, is what are the requirements for a company to commence business rescue? And there's two of them. The first being is the company financially distressed? And what does financially distressed mean? It's a concept, a new concept in South African law. I shouldn't say new, it's almost 10 years old now. But the idea is the company able to pay its debts as and when they come due in the ensuing 6 months? And that is where I go back to, is should the board be thinking about business rescue or liquidity questions only now in a time of crisis, or should it be something that's probably considered more often than you think? And so a 6 or 12 month forward-looking cash flow is essential. My experience is many businesses typically look at a long-term cash flow once, maybe twice a year in a process, typically around budgeting and around forward-looking. But it's a good habit, in my personal opinion, to be designing some sort of rolling cash flow that takes you from a sort of a weekly cash flow for the next 2 months into monthly cash flows for the next 3 to 9 months. And that would give management and you as a board a view as to your runway. And the second test, which would determine financially distressed, is if you think your company is going to become insolvent in the next 6 months. Now that may seem like an odd thing to think, but if your business has hit a pothole, an unexpected pothole that you can't solve for, and that loss of business or cash flow or product might lead to a situation where you know categorically that you are or will become insolvent at some point in the future. And those are the circumstances where you should be considering rescue. There is a second test, however. So if you've looked at your forward cash flow for 6 months and you've established that there's a reasonable likelihood that you're not going to be able to meet your obligations to your creditors as and when they fall due, you should be considering business rescue. In a larger entity, or sometimes in smaller, if you've got loans with bullet payments and those payments are due with, those bullets are due within the next year, if you can't meet those, this sort of conversation is one that you should be having on your board. In today's context, you've probably had some disruption to your supply chains or perhaps your ability to service your customers. And if that's happened, how is that going to impact on your cash flows going forward? And will that result in you not being able to meet your obligations to your lenders, for example, or maybe even just simply your creditors? Once you've established you're financially distressed, there's a second test. And I'll run through this. We'll allow some questions in a minute, and I'm sure you've got a few popping. But once you've established you're financially distressed, you need to address the second leg of the question, which is, and flick down one for me, Carl, there, which is you need to answer, the board has to conclude that the company can actually be rescued. And I think what this is aiming at is trying to avoid a situation where companies that are terminally ill and are no longer viable try to use business rescue as a tool to prolong their livelihood when in actual fact they should be in liquidation. And this is often a more difficult test to pass, because the board has to conclude that with the benefits of business rescue and the restructuring that can be achieved using a business rescue process, the company will be viable again. There's a very famous old case in South African law where the judge says that the clouds of doom will roll away and the sunshine of prosperity will once again shine on the company. And that really encapsulates it for me. So as a board, if you say we're financially distressed, the next question is well, what are we going to do or achieve in business rescue that will allow us to carry on as a going concern? And the key question there that I have with many boards is, has the company been on a slippery slope for a long time, or have they hit an unexpected or serious pothole in their business? And with some time and some breathing room, will they be able to navigate their way out of the predicament they find themselves in? And that's obviously something that's key. In the current environment where we've had dramatic impacts as a result of the coronavirus, you probably and most likely have many businesses that are facing a temporary setback. And the question then is business rescue the right tool to deal with the temporary setback? Carl,
John, maybe at this point, two notes, one around solvency and liquidity. And of course, as directors on the call, the directors on the call will be reminded that as part of our duty as a director of a company, we have to sign solvency and liquidity, essentially certificates, each time we make particular payments out of the business, such as dividend payments or loan repayments to related parties, or rent even to a related party. So for example, if in your business, the property that you're renting is owned by a family trust, there need to be solvency and liquidity certificates signed or resolutions signed by the board, by the directors prior to those payments. So the test that John was speaking to here of the 6-month solvency is in some ways a leaner test than the test we have to sign when we're making those payments that directors should be aware of. So a trigger for when you should be having the conversation often will be if you can't sign that certificate with comfort or that resolution with comfort, then that would trigger this conversation on the likes of business rescue. And so at this point, I think we want to go to just some questions on what John's shared so far. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can put a question in the chat box, the question and answer box, and we'll pick those up and start asking John those questions. While we see if there's any questions coming in, John, I've got one for you to start with, which is, how often do you find people are coming and speaking to you about business rescue when it's too late?
So typically the mindset of the business owner is, if we can just get around that next corner, we'll all be fine. And ultimately they don't make it around that corner. And then that conversation is far too late. And it's a very difficult thing because any cash flow forecast is driven by assumptions. So if you've got a 6-month cash projection on your business, it's driven by a series of assumptions, whether they be business as usual, growth, completion of projects on time, payment by your suppliers on time. There's a number of assumptions built into any cash flow forecast. And I think it's very key for a board to question the assumptions, because the number of times we say, but it's, why are you only talking to me now? Why weren't we talking 3 or 6 months ago? And they say, but 3 months ago, we thought everything would be fine. And we say, well, let's see that cash flow forecast. And when you look at it, you say, but would a reasonable person have believed this cash flow forecast? And I think as something to guard against as a board is be very careful that you don't believe your own propaganda. Make sure you interrogate those assumptions, and perhaps your 6-month cash flow needs to have some flex and some sensitivities in it to say, okay, we're running close to the line, but what are the key events or the key things we need to attend to make sure we get over the line, or that will become key triggers so that we start the conversation and reconvene and have a much sharper conversation if, for example, certain events don't happen.
Thanks, John. John, there's a question in the chat here. Do you choose the person to oversee the company?
Yeah, so I mean, we're getting into a little bit of the detail at the moment. We're just talking about financially distressed and the test you need to. So I'm happy to branch off.
Moment, if you like.
I'm happy to branch off because, so if you've passed the 2 tests and we need to commence business rescue, there's still a few more things the board should think about before you kick the switch. But the beauty of business rescue is if a board commences the process, they can choose their Carl will tell you that a board, in making any decision, has to exercise a lot of care in who they choose to run their business. Now, I'll freely admit I'm not the best person to run every business rescue, and you need to make sure that you are compatible with the person that you're going to choose to be your business rescue practitioner. And the decision of appointing a business rescue practitioner is one that can lead to consequences in terms of the Companies Act. You know, if you choose recklessly or poorly, it can still have consequences for you as a director. But the straight answer to the question is yes, you get to choose the business rescue practitioner if business rescue is commenced by the board.
Great, thanks, John. Are there any other questions from anyone on the definitions around what is financially distressed, and at what point should you be having the business rescue conversation? You know, what are the triggers for you in thinking about this as a business? And then we'll go into some more of the detail about what happens post this point. So there's another question come through. In the uncertainty of not knowing how long COVID will affect the economy, should that warrant earlier board conversations regarding what business rescue could imply for the company, from a business contingency perspective at least?
So the answer to that is 2 listed companies I'm involved with have convened urgent additional board meetings to consider the impact of COVID-19. My suggestion is you should have, if not a full board, perhaps a board subcommittee that meets regularly to reassess the performance of the business and the impact that COVID-19 is having on its ability to remain solvent for the foreseeable future. And the uncertainty is one of those difficult things, because right now, and we can get into this in a little bit more detail as we move on, is what does business rescue give you, and can you achieve the same without rescue, knowing that everyone, your clients, your customers, are all faced with very similar challenges. But effectively, I think having flexible forecasts and regular feedback, and perhaps a task team focus specifically on regularly testing the metrics that the business is performing to, is key here.
Thanks, John. There's another question coming through, which I've just asked for a little bit of clarification on before we answer. But if there are any other questions, please put them through either on the chat or the question and answer box. Just to this point of, should business contingency, or in the context of COVID-19, drive this conversation being held earlier? A couple of answers from myself around what at the Sirdar Group we've done with boards that we manage over the last 2 weeks. One is we've convened special meetings of all of the boards that we're involved in guiding, to ensure that they have a conversation about COVID-19 and what the impact of that on their businesses is going to be. And those conversations to date have been very well received from the feedback we've been getting across the clients we've been talking to around the continent and indeed around the world. The 2 takeaways from that process that I found really valuable, and John, you spoke about one of them just before, and that is, what are your assumptions? I think as a board, if you aren't clear on your assumptions that you're making in your process of considering the impact of COVID-19 on the business, then it's very difficult to work out what the cash flow looks like, work out whether or not you're financially distressed. So I always say in these scenarios, it's better to start with the assumptions and then do the Excel spreadsheet. You know, as all of us have heard in business before, any good accountant, I'm not necessarily going to put John and I in that category, but any good accountant can make the numbers look like whatever they want the numbers to look like. So start off with, what are your assumptions? And then model your assumptions. Because then if you don't like what the model's telling you, you can review your assumptions. And if your assumptions are what you believe, then that's going to give you a clear answer. The second thing that I want to give as a insight to the directors on the call is once you've worked out a set of assumptions with your management team or with your exco, and you've asked them to start implementing those decisions based on the set of assumptions that as a board you've agreed on, give your exco or give your management team the bandwidth to effectively implement those decisions, and only call back the board or call back the exco with the board if you believe as a director or as a set of directors that those assumptions have significantly changed, or ask your management team to call the board back to the table if they believe the set of assumptions has significantly changed. So I think the key message that I took from John, your comment, and reinforced what I think we've been seeing in the boardroom over the last 2 weeks, is focus on what those assumptions are. There's another question which I've asked you a little bit more context on, but maybe you can assist in the meantime. Can a company call force majeure in the case of business rescue? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I'm not sure it does, I suppose, but I mean, business rescue has, I suppose, let's examine.
I've got the clarification. Sorry, John. The clarification is, can a company that is entering business rescue tell its suppliers that it must cancel its contracts immediately, i.e. calling force majeure? I think so.
Okay, I was going to answer along a similar line. So business rescue places a moratorium on a supplier's ability to force you to pay them the amounts that are due and payable. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't change any of the other contractual terms immediately. The practitioner has the power to suspend or cancel contracts for the duration of business rescue. But if, for example, and perhaps the easiest one to examine is the relationship between a company and its landlord. If the company is in default of the provisions of its lease, the landlord still has the right to invoke the provisions of that lease vis-a-vis cancellation and or eviction. And I suppose if you have a contract or a relationship with suppliers that are governed by contract, that have provisions in them that allow you as the customer to call a force majeure and to stop supply or to change the terms of the engagement as between the parties, you can still enforce that. And the same applies on the other side. Your customers can enforce contractual rights. So anyone with contractual rights against the company can enforce them, with the exception of payment, which is where the moratorium comes on. I will say, however, we need to analyze it very carefully in respect of each contract. The case law is developing each year on these specific aspects of how business rescue impacts on contractual environments. So I think the answer is yes to the question. Commencing business rescue shouldn't affect the company's rights to enforce a force majeure or call a force majeure, or enforce any other contractual entitlement that they have. Once you have, however, defaulted or put the moratorium in place, one of the consequences is many suppliers may say, well, in that case, we're not interested in supplying you unless we get guarantees that you're going to pay for everything we supply from this day onwards. In other words, after commencing rescue.
And John, to that point, the business rescue practitioner, once the plan is approved, has the ability to make those sort of commitments on behalf of the company?
So once business rescue, I think let's move on a little bit, and Carl, and we'll pick up that, because I think that's we're getting into a little bit of the detail, and I think we're starting to talk now about what is the effect of business rescue on the business, and what's the benefits or the risks around that. So if you want to flick down, perhaps I'll talk to the next.
Okay, there's a couple of other questions we'll come back to in the course of the conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick things up and go backwards and forwards. So I suppose if as a board you've decided that you are financially distressed and you believe in your heart of hearts that the company can be rescued, given time and assistance, then you've got to take the next step and look at the risks around business rescue, the risks and the benefits, I suppose. And one of the key questions, and I think this is what this last question is starting to touch on, is what is different, or what can be achieved utilizing the business rescue process. So from a restructuring perspective, you need to say, well, if you commence rescue, you have a moratorium, which means you have breathing room. The problem with commencing business rescue is you have a rogue like myself who now becomes the supervisor of the business, and the board has to report effectively to the business rescue and acts at the business rescue practitioners and on the practitioner's instruction. There are a couple of, from a contracting perspective, and I haven't written it down on the slide, the rights of the parties aren't affected by business rescue. However, the practitioner does have the ability to suspend a contract if it's onerous. So if there's an onerous contract, the business rescue can suspend that for the duration of business rescue, or can go to court to have the court to cancel the contract. Now, obviously, once you start involving court processes, they aren't that quick and they aren't that effective. But if there is a situation you find yourself being forced to honor a contract, the commencement of rescue might allow you to suspend that obligation temporarily whilst you then develop your rescue plan and renegotiate a different term or a different structure with that customer. Often we do that in the case, and I'll go back to the use of a lease and a landlord. You may wish to close a branch. We can suspend the lease agreement. We can cancel it by going to court. But there's the simple threat of that brings the landlord to the table, and often you can achieve the savings and amendments or the consensual cancellation of a lease just simply by being in business rescue and having the supervision. The response of suppliers, customers, and service providers is improving year on year as you go through business rescue. But I think if we look at it, you're starting to ask the question about what can business rescue do to help me achieve the restructuring I need. I think as a board, you need to ask these questions yourself before you commence business rescue, because you need to know why simply having the moratorium in place will get you from A to B and allow you to survive. Or if it's more than just the moratorium and you actually need to achieve some structural reforms, perhaps you've opened a couple of branches that turned out to be ill-advised. Can you use the business rescue process to close those branches, to downscale your business again, and then be pushed back out into the world as a leaner, meaner, more focused organization? And sometimes rescue as a tool is a useful way of doing that. But I think as a board, if you want to achieve the best results out of rescue, you need to have thought about these processes. In other words, what does the business look like post-rescue? What does it look like now? A business rescue practitioner is not necessarily an expert in your industry. What he's an expert in is in business rescue law and how to implement a business rescue plan. I am not the world's best at management consulting or telling you how to run your business better. I ask a lot of awkward questions, and hopefully that stimulates the conversation. But the rescues that work best are the ones where the board has identified the surgery it needs and knows more or less what it's going to look like when it comes out of rescue. The practitioner should test that and really give it a proper full go to make sure that the principles are sound and the logic applies, and then you can proceed and go through there. One of the key impacts of business rescue that you do need to consider is how you're going to fund rescue. 99% of your suppliers will insist on some sort of payment guarantee or cash on delivery basis, and if you haven't given thought to, well, what happens now that we move to a COD structure, and how do we fund that? Your business rescue's not likely to succeed. Typically, every rescue needs a champion. It needs somebody who wants to see the business survive. that is trickier in a bigger listed environment because you don't have shareholders who are fully engaged with the business and typically have the ability to provide capital. And if you do need to go and tap your shareholders for some funding to achieve the restructuring, that's a little more complicated in the listed environment or the bigger environment. But you need to identify who's the champion of this rescue, who's going to drive it from commencement to conclusion, and who's going to fund it. Now, often that process is simply a process of identifying who the key stakeholders are and what their exposures and to your business are. Now, you may find that one of your customers is a key stakeholder who would be willing to fund a rescue because they are reliant on your product. You may also find that you get quite a lot of leeway from suppliers who, for you, you're a big customer of theirs, and your demise would kill their business. And if you understand the dynamics that exist between yourself or your company, your customers, your suppliers, I think in old management school speak, it would be the Porter's five forces, in terms of where does your business fit in that equation. It will help you develop a business rescue plan and a process and an idea of how you can go from there.
Right.
Carl, if you flick down one slide, I mean, perhaps we'll do the next one and then go back to the questions, because I'm starting to touch on the key debate once you've realized that your business is under pressure. It's made, let's call it financially stressed, maybe not yet distressed, but on the road there. The question then is can you navigate the crisis without commencing business rescue? And this goes to touch on some of what I was talking about now, is who are your key stakeholders? Who is going to be the funder or the champion of this business rescue? Do you have shareholders who are engaged, who will assist the board in delivering a rescue and a restructured entity? What is the shape of your lenders and an investor group? And are they exposed? How exposed are they to your company should it fail? And perhaps you can source funding from your lender group who will lend to protect. And then I've touched on the nature of the relationship between your company and its stakeholders, and just understanding that. And I think this goes to a very important question. As business rescue practitioners, we are told to do a detailed assessment of whether the company is a good candidate for rescue. And we're looking to answer the key questions as, can the company survive post-rescue, and what does it look like post-rescue? And one of the things I always debate with the board is, can we achieve what you need to achieve without rescue? Do you have 2 or 3 key stakeholders for whom the survival of your business is key? And with the support of just those 4 or 5 stakeholders, can you achieve a rescue? And that may be 2 suppliers, a customer or 2, and maybe your lenders, all giving a little bit of leeway that achieve the same impact as rescue would have, which is the time you need to navigate the storm.
Right.
I see there's some more questions.
There's a couple of questions coming through. I think one here, I think it's worth taking this point, is the comment that I sense that many consulting firms are seeding business rescue anxiety amongst clients in these trying times. How can we best support companies not to be unnecessarily distressed logically, yet monitoring the situation?
So my experience of encountering boards or management of distressed companies is that their focus has become very short-term and they've become very nearsighted. And I think one of the key things that you can do if you are engaging with clients or companies that are distressed is to try and lift their vision and just lengthen the period over which they're thinking. So typically, if I explain it slightly differently, when you get there, a company will say to you, we're distressed, we can't pay our wages at the end of the month. And around about today is about the day you start getting the calls on the 20th. I've got to pay wages on the 25th and I don't have the money. And there's a very short-term approach to managing and running the business. And I think right now in the present crisis, you've got companies that will be faced with customers canceling orders, a massive drop-off in demand, or perhaps even just simple disruption to your own ability to produce product because of the measures you've got to put in place around safety of your employees and the health of your employees. And you need to help those boards and those companies look a bit further out into the future to say, well, we're now in a position where if we use the SAA example, SAA are looking at it and they're saying there's a travel ban being imposed by government. Before that, we had travel bans imposed by global governments. Our forward bookings have disappeared off the end of a cliff. They've today taken the decision to suspend flights to 31 May. So they've looked at it and they've said, we can see the crisis running a course and hopefully demand for air travel will return in 2 to 3 months' time. I imagine they've looked at that and they've said, well, it's a short-term cash pressure because we've got no bookings and we've got a fixed cost overhead or fixed structure business. What can we do? And they've looked far enough in the future, it seems, to say, well, if we make changes now, and they may seem very drastic, but if we effectively mothball our services or most of our services immediately, we have the cash reserves to last to the end of May and into June, and hopefully by then things have come back. So if you can try and move the conversation into a longer term focus, you can often answer many of the questions that you need to, or help the company answer many of the questions as to how you need to move forward.
Thanks, John. And maybe I'd just like to add to that, I think for many businesses, it is creating distress and it is creating anxiety among directors and entrepreneurs. I think in many cases, it's forced people to look at things they haven't been looking at up until now. And, you know, I think we do have a sense that there will be people who use this opportunity to justify why they've closed their business, and will be able to look back on it and will say, no, they had to close their business because of COVID-19, but actually COVID-19 has just brought an underlying issue to the fore and forced them to address it. So I don't think it's so much about having a conversation unnecessarily with people, but it's about making sure people have the discussion, or businesses, directors, entrepreneurs have the discussion. And if, going back to your set of assumptions, you look at your business and you see that you're going to be comfortable or you're going to be okay, then you've had the conversation, you're able to tick that box and focus on delivering on those assumptions over the course of the next few weeks. There's a couple of other questions here. Read test 1, pay debts over next 6 months. If this is dependent on a debt provider restructuring, and that decision is likely to be positive but is pending, at what point do you call business rescue? And do you potentially discuss this with your debt provider?
So that is very tricky. So as a board, I think you have to be realistic about, is there a reasonable prospect of the funding being advanced? Is the debt provider still engaging with you genuinely, or are they kicking for touch? And I think that the important thing to understand as a board is, if you know that is your trigger and you're not getting the answers, you have to work out how to bring the conversation to a head. And that becomes important for you as a director, because if the funding doesn't come, and heaven forbid the company ends up in liquidation, you may well find a liquidator poking his nose around and saying, but it was unreasonable of you to have expected that funder to provide the funding. And you as a director have now incurred liability at a point when you should have known that you wouldn't have been able to pay that debt back. And it's a very, very tricky one to answer. If you are genuinely concerned, you probably need to just broach the subject with your attorney just to make sure. The law does provide that if you have a reasonable expectation of the funding or of the events unfolding, and that goes to the assumptions, the credibility of the assumptions around the model that you've built. If they are credible and reasonable and sensible, then you have a defense in terms of your actions, and you have a genuine reason for holding on and trying to achieve the event or the funding. But if you haven't, for example, amended your assumptions around your sales forecast and your sales outline at the current moment, or if you haven't done some sort of sensitivity on it, that may be seen as unreasonable behavior. You need to have had a good hard look and a good hard think about the impact of COVID-19 on your business's metrics.
And I think the last question at this point, before we go to the next slide, John, is can you please explain a bit further the concept of temporary moratorium in terms of timeframes? For how long can the bus be given breathing space, and what are the implications of financial obligations?
Okay, so yeah, so if you commence business rescue, you'd effectively draw a line in the sand and you park your obligation to make payment to your creditors in respect of amounts that were due and payable as at commencement of rescue. If you are continuing to occupy premises, you have to pay your landlord. If you're continuing to consume electricity, you have to pay for that electricity. If you're going to carry on making phone calls, you have to keep paying. Very simple examples here, but you almost draw a line on the page, and amounts that you owed pre-rescue are in this moratorium. Amounts that you now have to pay for the consumption you use post-rescue. So that might be you need a supplier to supply you with raw materials so you can make product. You're going to have to pay for that product that you take delivery of post-rescue. It's also very important to understand if your suppliers have a reservation of ownership over their product. If they do and you haven't paid for them, if you want to use it, you have to be prepared to pay for it. To answer your question about how long does it last for, the moratorium lasts for as long as the company remains in business rescue. Now, the process is designed to be a relatively short and quick process. It often runs for longer than the Act anticipates. But the way it's controlled is the creditors have to vote for extensions of time in business rescue, and creditors become the ones who approve the business rescue plan. So whilst the board has the choice to commence rescue and choose the practitioner, once you have done that as a board, the power shifts, I suppose, to the creditors, who collectively and by majority decide on the timeframes or the extension of timeframes and the ultimate restructuring. So to the extent your creditors believe that you have a credible chance of surviving, you generally secure those extensions of time. Every now and again, we'll commence a rescue, and the conversation that we have with the creditors post-commencement is very different from the conversation we've had with the board pre-commencement. And in those situations, business rescue is doomed. So I think it goes back to, you need to have honest conversations with yourselves and be clear that the decisions you're making and the assumptions that are driving those decisions are very well thought out and interrogated.
Thanks, John. I'm going to go to your last slide on crisis management, which I think is a good opportunity for everyone to get some takeaway for managing their business even in this time, even if business rescue is not something that, based on the conversation today, people are feeling that they need to address in their own business.
So when I saw the webinar topic, it's obviously an important topic to discuss, but my gut feel is, in the current circumstances, with the correct approach and intervention, many businesses can avoid a formal process of business rescue by embarking on a clear strategy to deal with the crisis. And that goes to Carl's question around viability. If your business is viable and this is a temporary glitch and you have a balanced relationship between yourself, your customers, your suppliers, in other words, you all need each other to survive, embarking on a clear and defined crisis management process is key. This, funnily enough, actually mirrors a little bit as how a business rescue process unfolds, because the very first questions a practitioner wants to understand is, what is the problem? Why is the company in distress? And how much cash do we have available to fund the restructuring? In other words, how much runway do we have? How much time do we have? What is the framework of that position? So typically you'd sit and you'd want to understand the immediate cash flow situation. Well, first, what has caused the distress? What does the immediate to medium term cash flow look like? In other words, and often I try to get businesses to think about cash flows daily, for the next 2 weeks, weekly for the next 2 months, and monthly for the next 4 months, so that I've got a 6-month look. And once you've established what the problem is and what runway you've got, then you can move into identifying who the key stakeholders are and commencing conversations with them. Because I guarantee you, if you are battling, your customer is battling, your supplier is battling. All three of you in that chain are in a very similar position. Your lender might be in a slightly different position, but because he's not directly involved in your chain. But you need to commence discussions with those stakeholders. Now, it may seem a strange thing to suggest that you must go to your lender and say, I am facing an unprecedented crisis because of coronavirus. We've got a couple of outcomes here, but we genuinely believe we still have a viable business, but we need your support to help us get through it. Now, obviously, a key in the evaluation phase is to understand what the ask will be of those stakeholders. The initial conversation is generally, we're battling, are you also battling? We're battling, we believe we can survive, we need you to help. They'll say, well, how do you want us to help? It may be extension of payment terms with your suppliers. It may be a conversion to a consignment structured supplier agreement, so that you can better manage your cash flows. With your lenders, it might be some leniency or some payment holidays, and various things. And if you understand that, you can start to have the conversations. The important thing, though, is you need to build a trust relationship. You need to be open, you need to be honest, you need to have genuine conversations. In the informal workouts that we've done, very, very seldom have we seen a strong and knee-jerk response from suppliers and creditors. Normally, with a correct conversation in an environment that builds trust, you can achieve that. And to further the conversation, you often need to convince those stakeholders that you have a strong control system in place that will help deliver what it is you promise or where you get to. And that comes to what I've split out as stage 3 and 4 here, but they're effectively the same thing. You need to establish very strong cash management principles, driven from your financial director down. And as a business, you have to make sure that you have no sacred cows. Now, what that means is the owner's pet project, or you've got to deal with everything as clinically as you can. And you have to have a very, very strong internal control system to deliver it. Because what comes after your initial consultation with the stakeholders is reporting back on how you've delivered. what it is you've intended to deliver. So if you ask stakeholders for some leeway or some runway to achieve a restructuring, and you will say to them, I need extended payment terms, but you've got to then make commitments to staying within those terms. You need to make sure you can deliver on that, and you need to report back to your stakeholders regularly and openly and honestly as to how you're progressing. And that again reinforces the trust relationship that you've got. This process, and I said to Carl, this is a topic entirely in itself. You can have full sessions on each one of these levels, and I'm running through it very quickly. But this is a 3 to 6 month process of buying some time, negotiating with your stakeholders, building the trust, working hard to deliver it, reporting back to them on how you're progressing, working with them to achieve it. And ultimately, you'll change, if it works well, you'll change the habits within your organization and come out as sort of a much leaner and better organization.
Thanks, John. And I think that's a brilliant place to start bringing the webinar to a close in terms of seeing this as an opportunity for businesses to be stronger at the end of the inverted commas crisis. And certainly the comment you made about thinking about the next step and where a business is going to be in 6 months' time is conversations we're having with boards. As you have the discussion about what the impact of COVID-19 is on your business and whether or not the likes of business rescue or liquidation or continuation are discussions your business should be having. Think about what do you want your organization to look like in 6 months' time. For anyone who wants to connect with John, John, I don't know if you just want to quickly share exactly the point at which someone should give you a call, but I have put your details up on the screen there for anyone who is feeling as a result of this conversation that there needs to be engagement with you. But do you want to take 30 seconds just to frame that?
So my view is if you feel that your company is stressed, is financially stressed, you may not be distressed, and I'm drawing a subtle distinction there. You should probably be talking to your attorney or a turnaround expert or an external someone to just make sure that you are thinking about the problem correctly, and maybe just to stress test some of the assumptions you've got around your business. It will have one of two effects. It will either reassure you that you are on a sensible path and traveling in the right direction, or perhaps it will pose a few more questions that, when answered, will get you back onto that path. And I think the earlier you engage with people around, we're not 100% sure if we are distressed or whether we need to be having this conversation or not, the better. I've got one very large client who I've now been talking on and off to for about 6 or 7 months. And we have a lot of very similar conversations, and they just want to make 100% sure that they are thinking about things in the right way. And I think rather have the conversation sooner than later, better outcomes are achieved by early intervention.
Thanks, John, and thank you for taking time to join the conversation and connect with us and share your expertise in this space to everyone that's joined this discussion today, and we'll be making it available offline as well for those that have missed the live conversation today. I think as we go through this time and as we navigate the blizzard, it's so important that people get the right insight. And to the point that was made earlier on the chat, so often in this process, we can feel like we don't know who to turn to and who to trust. And I just would ask everyone on the webinar to watch out for some of the announcements that will be made in the media on Monday around a collection of businesses that are coming together to support businesses like your own through this time to answer these questions. I've just shared in the chat for everyone. Please, we'd love to hear what your key insight was out of today's webinar. So please go on to Twitter and tag us in your note, share your key insight, and put those hashtags navigating the blizzard and hashtag webinars. And we'd love to connect you into the series that we're running. Roger Hitchcock, my business partner, in the Sirdar Group and one of our key leads on supporting directors and boardrooms and training and development across the continent. Will be leading the next webinar next Monday. If you want to join that, just watch out for those on our news feed or on our website. But thanks so much for the time. We want to honor everyone's time. We know that there's a lot going on in the business world this afternoon. So thanks, John. Thanks to Roger and to Jenny from the Sirdar Group who have made today possible. And we look forward to seeing your businesses come out stronger as a result of the opportunity that COVID-19 has given us all to look at our businesses and say, where can we be better in the future? Lastly, please make sure you complete the survey that comes up on your screen at the end of the webinar. Thanks so much and have a good Friday afternoon.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks, Paul.
Cheers, John.